Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan at MS Pearce. Ukraine war news update, second part thereof for the 17th of November 2023. Let's get straight to where we normally start, the military aid segment for this video. And we're going to start with supplies of key 155mm artillery shells to Ukraine have decreased since the start of Israel's war against Hamas, says President Zelensky. I reported on this earlier because in the same article there was some other information to talk to you about. Well, the article is a Bloomberg one saying Zelensky says shell supply to Ukraine slowed by Israel-Hamas war. The key details are, quote, our supplies have decreased, Zelensky told a group of journalists in his office in Kyiv on Thursday. Quote, it is life and it is normal as everyone is fighting for survival and we should defend ourselves as well. The outbreak of the conflict in the Middle East has raised questions about allies' ability to remain focused on supporting Ukraine, where a months-long counteroffensive has made little progress in retaking occupied territory. Icy temperatures are now encroaching on the war-battered nation in its 21st month of conflict. Zelensky has spent this week assuring allies that his military is making preparations to take the fight through the winter. A delegation from Kyiv visited Washington this week, where House lawmakers passed a funding bill that doesn't include aid to Ukraine amid resistance by Republican lawmakers. Quote, now I am focused on getting aid from the West, Zelensky said. Their, quote, focus is shifting because of the Middle East and other reasons. Without this support, we will move backward. In fact, it's probably a good time to mention the news about the funding. So Biden has signed a temporary spending bill without aid for Ukraine and Israel. So unfortunately, the House Republicans, or at least the House Republican Speaker, House of Representatives Speaker Mike Johnson, said, right, we're not going to pass this $106 billion funding bill for Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and the southern border. We want to separate it out and we want to do Israel separately. This is really just an excuse to get Israel funding through and to put a stop or to try and get leverage over the Ukraine funding, because I presume because it's something the Democrats want to do rather than that's the right thing to do. It's really annoying. As a result, because the government didn't want to shut down, Biden's had to sign off the amended sort of temporary spending bill that doesn't include those key elements of Israel and Ukraine. And so he's been kind of held hostage by these Republicans, it seems. And as a result, Ukraine doesn't have the funding. That's not going to be discussed till after the 23rd, after Thanksgiving. And Biden had to do that in order to keep the government kind of functioning. Okay. Dozens of pieces per month. Ukraine mass produces its own analogues of Shaheeds, according to Kamishin, Minister of Strategic Industry. He's a guy with a top knot that used to be in charge of the railway. The defense industry started serial production of the UAV, the drone, the official name of which is not disclosed, saying Ukrainian Shahed. This would be very useful. The Iranian Shaheeds have been a real thorn in the side of the Ukrainians for a long time. And it would be fantastic if the Ukrainians could indigenously produce their own version of them and fire them into Russia to do the same kind of stuff that Russians are doing to them. Right, Latvian volunteers from SOS Help for Ukraine have purchased 4 Bandvan 202 all-terrain vehicles from Norway and delivered them to the 115th Mechanized Brigade in Ukraine. This is fantastic. These are what they look like. I've shown you one of these crossing a bit of a waterway previously, thinking how the hell do they stay afloat? Anyway, this is what they look like. They're very used to tackling things like snow in the Nordic area, but very useful, hopefully useful in negotiating their way through the Rasputitsa, the mud that hits at this time of year. 76,000 euros was raised by Latvian community in Chicago. Next steps of volunteers purchase high-tech drones and night vision devices and energy solutions. Thank you. That's great. Fantastic. These Latvian volunteers, predominantly it looks in Chicago in the US. So excellent stuff. Right. Here we have a whole bunch of vehicles. They look like Mitsubishi, was it L500s? Or similar. These are I think, armed with machine guns on top, and are designed to take out drones as far as I can work out. And a bunch of these are now hitting the road. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at least 6 of these in a row. I've talked to you about the range of things, and the 7th one over there, a range of these weapons being used against things like the Shaheeds, whether they are, auto cannons, old anti-aircraft guns, here in this case, machine guns on the back of SUVs and whatnot. The whole range of stuff is needed. It's good stuff. So we've been seeing a few of these convoys in Kherson Oblast and also in Zaporizhia and Donbass, according to someone who's evidently in Ukraine. Can you explain what we're seeing? Guns to protect the skies from Iranian drones. That's good news there. Right. Denmark. So this is great because that is, in the event of not receiving, say, Gepards and Gepard ammunition, this will do at least something. These will be useful. Get a bunch of these placed around. You can maybe have community volunteers operating things like this instead of the actual army. I don't know, just sort of spitballing, but rather than having mobilized troops and using them in behind the front line and doing stuff like this, you could get volunteers, veterans, community members to react to air raid alerts and get out there and scan the skies and fire those things off. Denmark has handed over unique autonomous hydrographic complexes to Ukraine. It's not the first time we heard about this. We've heard about these drone complexes before. This was announced by the head of the Hydrographic Service of the Ukrainian Navy, Roman Honcharenko. The main task of the multi-beam Echo sounder is to collect accurate data on the seabed and the marine environment. One of the targets for these drones would be to indicate whether there are mines, or either some mines that have been washed away, so anti-tank mines, or indeed actual naval marine mines, but also for other, hydrographic usage. The situation on the battlefield in Ukraine is more complicated than NATO expected, according to Jens Stoltenberg, the Alliance Secretary General. Interestingly, Kallas, who is, Lithuanian, Latvia, one of the Baltic states, the leader, she's touted to be the next. She's putting her name in the hat for being the next NATO Alliance Secretary. Anyway, he emphasized that this, quote, is not an argument against support. It is an argument in favor of greater support for Ukraine because we cannot allow President Putin to win. I guess it's the idea that the Russians have a better army, or more of them at least, than was initially anticipated, that the fortifications that were more complicated and problematic, and the amount of mines, so on and so forth. The Russian Technological University, MIREA, purchased a drone detector Sky-Eye manufactured by the Canadian company Skycope Technologies Inc. Agentstvo reports this with reference to data from the Russian centralized government procurement website. Importing this system into Russia likely violates Canadian sanctions. I reported this yesterday. Here's a little bit more detail. Allegedly, RTU MIREA can use this system for research purposes, as it is developing anti-drone devices. Simultaneously with the purchase of the Sky-Eye, RTU MIREA held another tender and purchased 3 anti-drone guns. Skyscope Technologies announced on its website that, quote, this is the first time we have heard that our device has been used at Moscow University, and we suspect it is either fake news or a counterfeit product or obtained illegally for reverse engineering purposes. In light of our products or counterfeit versions of them appearing in Russia or on Russian websites, we hereby declare that as a Canadian company, we adhere to Canada's export restrictions. We do not provide products and services to countries where they are prohibited. Part of the problem with these kind of sanctions, or any sanctions, is that you can genuinely sell these to third parties who themselves sell them to another third party, and that ends up getting to, say, Russia. But the original company selling them didn't intend that and didn't know that it's going to happen. So it's very easy to get around sanctions, really. It's about closing those loopholes. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second with regard to oil. In fact, we'll talk about that now. Russian figures suggest Western oil sanctions are not working. This is a Bloomberg article. As you can see here, Russian oil revenues rebound. So April 2022, they skyrocketed because the price went nuts because the war started, if you remember that, and then sanctions were put in place, and they really struggled to make the money they were hoping. And then it has rebounded since then as loopholes have been found, as Russia has found buyers for their products, and the oil cap has started not to be effective. A spokesperson for the US Treasury Department said that while the first phase of the price cap focused on reducing the amount of revenue Russia gains from oil sales, the second phase of the measure will focus on increasing the costs Russia has to pay to keep its fleet of tankers running. To do that, the department has begun sanctioning shipping companies and vessels it says have transported oil sold above the cap and started to look for ways to increase the cost for Russia for using its shadow fleet. To counteract the West's restrictions, Russia pivoted away from Western shipping and services. It has done so by using a vast shadow fleet of tankers that have unclear ownership and insurance status. In other words, so just to remind you, I talked about this the other day, but because the UK has a effective monopoly, not as a single insurance firm, but most of the maritime insurance firms are based in the UK, it means that they can be controlled by allies of Ukraine, and they stopped insurance being given to vessels who were transporting oil and selling it at over $60 a barrel. And this meant without insurance they couldn't dock, they couldn't really sail, but they end up doing so, turning off transponders, using ghost ships, so on and so forth, and possibly getting either not having insurance and sailing anyway, but then there's problems with docking, but then money changes hands. They might have alternatives to insurance, maybe self-insuring, but again, it's still a problem doing that and getting official docking permits. But evidently, they've found ways around this. Privately, European Union officials acknowledge that the price cap isn't working well. That's anymore. I mean, it did work really well. It worked surprisingly well at the beginning. Back in September, US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen admitted the approach was losing its sting. And as you can see, the rebound is very real, both in terms of rubles and in terms of dollar revenue. The increase in Russia's revenues comes as the price of the nation's barrels has been growing, both in absolute terms and relative to the international Brent benchmark. A sharp depreciation of the ruble in the recent months has also helped to boost revenues from oil sales denominated in foreign currencies. So as a ruble falls, they can sell in other currencies and get a shed load of rubles, so on and so forth. As part of its pivot toward trying to boost Russia's costs, the US Treasury recently sanctioned 5 tankers for breaching the price cap. It's also written to ship management companies asking them for information regarding about 100 tankers that moved Russian oil. It's not clear if the measures will do anything to dim the shadow fleet trade in oil. The European Union is also trying to make it harder for tankers that are beneficially owned by Europeans to be sold into the shadow fleet. Greece is a big member of that. Cyprus, Greece, maritime shipping plays a large role in the shadow fleet world that could ensnare parts of the Greek fleet, as it says here. Goodness, even if large numbers of I honestly don't read ahead. Even if large numbers of vessels have already switched over, so there was this really interesting bit of data that came out to show that Greek maritime industry had loads of ships, and then basically at one point at the end of last year or sometime last year, they suddenly had way fewer ships, and because they transferred ownership of those ships to dodgy, shadowy entities basically involved with Russia. Almost 30% of Russian oil shipments had some sort of involvement with a G7 entity that's a group of seven sort of richest nations in October, according to data compiled by the KSE Institute, which is part of the Ukrainian organization that's pushing for stiffer sanctions on Moscow. According to a detailed analysis of exports, almost all Russian seaborne cargoes were bought above the cap in October, the Institute said. So in other words, the cap is just not working. And so they're looking at other ways of sanctioning the transport of that oil. Another Bloomberg article here says Russia detains former Carlsberg executives as the row deepens. Now, Carlsberg stayed in Russia and got under a lot of pressure for doing so. And then they tried to sell off their Russian entities. And effectively, the Russian state sort of stole, is it Baltica? Baltica Brewing Company. off them, and that really pissed Carlsberg off, and they came out strongly against Russia recently, and I reported that. And then in June, Russia, as it says here, in June, Russia seized control of Baltika, the local subsidiary of Carlsberg, under a presidential decree that allows for the assets of companies or individuals from unfriendly nations to be taken over by the state. Before the seizure, Carlsberg had been trying to divest its Russian business, so they had been trying to offload it, not just staying in there to keep on making profits, but it was like, if you're going to divest, you can't just, well, you can, I guess, but then you lose even more money. The idea is to divest it whilst not losing as much money as possible from your own kind of shareholders' perspective. But that just wasn't happening. And in the end, the state nicked Baltika. Before the seizure, Carlsberg had been trying to divest its Russian business. The Federal Property Management Agency later appointed Putin's ally, Taimuraz Boloyev, to lead Baltika. Last month, Carlsberg said it will terminate all license agreements to sell its beer brands in Russia, and that it sees no path to a negotiated exit from the country after the asset seizure. Russia is challenging the decision in court. Quote, "It is appalling that the efforts of the Russian state to justify their illegal takeover of our business in Russia has now evolved into targeting innocent employees." So two Carlsberg employees, or Baltika employees, have been arrested, and under suspicion of fraud. Not particularly surprising. Another Bloomberg article here. US sounds alarm on Hungary's planned crackdown on media and NGOs. This is really worrying. This is about democratic backsliding in Hungary as part of the EU, and the EU's obviously really upset about this kind of movement, but there's not a lot they can do about it short of, all they can do is really withhold funding in the kind of bribery. There's no mechanism in place to properly hold European nations to account and even expel them from the EU. It's not a kind of thing that they can easily do. A US envoy to Hungary called a proposal by Prime Minister Viktor Orban to target media and civic groups potentially very dangerous, as the nationalist leader prepares to unveil the latest crackdown on independent institutions. Orban's government has signalled it'll move ahead with a sovereignty protection package targeting foreign-funded political groups, media and non-governmental organisations, and potential prison terms for those who run afoul. Although the cabinet pledged to unveil details this week, it is yet to file the legislation to Parliament. The problem here is that if this was in place in Hungary as they were trying to accede to the EU would not have let Hungary in. But Hungary allowed in by passing all the transparency criteria, tick, 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 and then they backslide from then, but they're already in the EU. That's a real problem. Goodness me, I think Hungary should be ejected, or there should be EU just have a real dilemma on their hand in trying to deal with these kind of backsliding events. Anyway, quote, "To the extent that this bill may seek to criminalise and to intimidate independent civil society and media organisations, that is very dangerous, and I hope that's not a path that Hungary chooses to go down," US Ambassador David Pressman told reporters on Thursday. He said the US would take a close look at the bill once it's published. Scrutiny over the measures takes place at the European Union as the European Union considers whether to unlock some of the more than $30 billion in funding earmarked for Hungary, suspended last year on accusations over the erosion of the rule of law and graft concerns. In a speech on Monday, Orban, a staunch supporter of former US President Donald Trump, said the bill will seek to take on what he sees as liberal hegemony in Europe. Now, there's a wider problem here, and this may look like me trying to have a go at Donald Trump, but actually this is a genuine worry about democratic backsliding. So we have seen that Trump, in his speeches, routinely at the moment, daily at the moment, talks about Viktor Orban in glowing terms, right? He loves Viktor Orban. He sent him a MAGA cap. Viktor Orban wore the MAGA cap and gave glowing endorsements of Donald Trump. So if Donald Trump ends up being the president of the US, and this is how much Trump worries me, because he loves autocrats, he loves strong men, Kim Jong-un, Jair Bolsonaro, Viktor Orban, Vladimir Putin, Xi Jinping. He loves them all, right? And he talks glowingly about them all. And then these governments then put in place things that democratically backslide that are unhealthy for the world, for liberal democracies around the world. And if you've got a president in the most important position in global politics, essentially rubber stamping this by validating the very government and the very dictator that's doing that, you've got a serious problem. Like, the American diplomats are doing the right thing here in calling someone like Orban and his activities, calling them out here. But if Trump goes and wins a presidential it becomes president in 2024, then that's the US essentially looking to validate this kind of activity. Is really, really worrying. Goodness me, I hope Trump doesn't get in, because he is very much an isolationist, very much an authoritarian lover, and he will have this situation again where he wants things to happen, and he's probably going to have diplomats who want the opposite to what he wants, and you get this tension within the foreign diplomatic corps with like central government in Trump land, and it's just it's a worry. This, like, whatever I know, many of you might really like Trump, many of my American viewers, but honestly, from a neutral, independent, international point of view, he's not a good look for American leader. It really isn't. So anyway, the legislation which drew criticism at the EU ministerial meeting in Brussels on Wednesday for its potential impact on civil society, is still being debated. Nepzava newspaper reported, citing Hungary's EU Affairs Minister János Boka. Orban, who started his career as an anti-communist student leader in the 1980s, has evolved into a nationalist disruptor in the EU and has expressed open admiration towards autocratic leaders. Since his return to the premiership in 2010, he cemented his grip over independent institutions by appointing loyalists to lead state agencies, the courts, universities and cultural institutions. Complete democratic backsliding. Even as Orban condemns what he sees as attempts to intervene in Hungarian politics, he regularly campaigns on behalf of nationalist and populist candidates around Europe and beyond. He's repeatedly said he backs Trump's bid to return to the White House. What you need to do is look at people that Orban holds up in high regard and wonder. And if Trump's one of them, you've got to wonder why both Putin and Orban want Trump to be the leader of the US. Ask yourselves that. If you're a Trump supporter, ask yourself why Russia and Hungary want Trump to be the leader, and why the CPAC, the Conservative Conference, keeps taking place in Budapest in Hungary. This is a real worry. Follow the money. I wrote a massive article on linking money from places like Heritage Foundation, linking that money back to Hungary and to Russia. It is a massive concern. Wake up to this stuff that's going on. I remember, as I've said before, having an argument with my dad over Brexit, and sorry to bring that into it, but I was like, Dad, look, you've got to worry when you look around the world and see who wants Brexit to happen. And if Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin are one of the main entities that want the UK to leave the EU, you've got to wonder why that is and whether it's a good decision to do that. Anyway, moving on. Bulgarian defense minister, pro-Russian disinformation weakens the Bulgarian army. Again, hugely worrying. I refer you back to my extra video yesterday talking about Russian trolls and disinformation. It's such a concern. Pro-Russian disinformation targeting Bulgaria has started to, quote, seriously affect the army's ability to fight, Bulgarian Defense Minister Todor Tagarev has said in a debate in Parliament. Goodness me, I don't know what exactly is going on there, but that sounds worrying. Finland is closing 4 checkpoints on the border with Russia, according to the Finnish Prime Minister. Citizens of Iraq, Yemen and other countries began to come to Finland through Russia, motivated by Russians, the Russians basically sending them through the borders to cause kind of social cohesion issues within Finland. It's all this attempt to destabilize other countries. Finland believes that Russia is doing this on purpose and is sponsoring it financially. And Jessica Arrow here says, breaking asylum seeker who crossed the border from Russia to Finland on Monday tells that Russian police assisted him to get to the Finnish border. So finally he crossed with a bicycle. So Finnish news reporting that you have an asylum seeker saying he was paid by the Russian police. to go into Finland. There you go. Estonia is going to close its border with Russia after Finland, is the question. Are they? Russia does not detain illegal migrants travelling to Estonia at its border. This was stated by the head of Estonian Interior Ministry, Lauri Läänemets. Earlier, Finland decided to close border crossings with Russia due to similar accusations. So the same kind of things happening with the Baltics and indeed, I believe, with Poland. And Belarusian borders are doing the same kind of thing. Talking about borders here, the head of the International Department of the Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Anna Lyubima, explained why Ukrainian businesses don't create competition for EU businesses. Quote, investors who relocated their businesses and created jobs in the EU countries are utilizing investment instruments available in those countries. This means that the additional tax revenue contributed to the budget of those countries by the Ukrainian companies. Ukraine is on the way to becoming a part of the EU. In the future, it is highly likely there will be a single market encompassing Ukraine. It's not possible to just refuse or decline these possibilities. We should talk about joint ventures, about subcontracting, she added. Ukrainian refugees who are helping to fill labour shortages now are another benefit to the EU market, the head of the International Department of Ukrainian Chamber of Commerce and Industry said. Ukraine was responsible for half of the world's sunflower oil supply. In 2023, Ukrainian harvest increased compared to 2022. The problem with exporting huge amounts of grain products is not only an issue for the Ukrainian economy, it also affects a global food security problem. So those are the arguments being presented back to the truckers and to Poland, since they are blocking the borders, which is really causing a lot of issue. I understand that military aid is now being processed through Germany rather than Poland, or at least more of it is. Anton Gerashchenko here says Putin could face a new war crime case as evidence suggests starvation of Ukraine was pre-planned, The Independent informs. The international law firm Global Rights Compliance is working on this. GRC found evidence that in December 2021, so before the war started, Russia purchased 3 huge 170-meter grain containers to export grain by sea. Also, in the first week of the occupation, the export of grain from the occupied territories began. Up to 12,000 tons per day were exported at times. There are other signs of preparations for the export of grain. If it can be proved that this was a plan, Putin will again be put on the international wanted list for the planned starvation of Ukraine. And it sounds very similar to Holodomor. History rhymes. US President Joe Biden and Japanese Prime Minister Kishida met in San Francisco. So he met with Xi Jinping from China in San Francisco and now meeting the Japanese premier. During the meeting, the heads of state agreed on the continuation of tough sanctions against the Russian Federation and the strong support for Ukraine. So this is really important. It's really important that the G7 keep up the pressure on sanctions, closing the loopholes and supporting Ukraine. Anyway, that's enough from me. Really appreciate all your support. Thank you so much for all those who do support the channel. Special shout out to Gary Knapp for his kindness, Matt Kirk, Jon Ivar Helgeson, these people that help in other ways. Really appreciate that. Rob Travis Photography, who else? Mark Biscu as ever, Sebastian Castorina, Peter Kluken, Andrew France. Really appreciate that. And Warren Wasson again, I said that recently. Thank you for your support, and please check out the live I'm going to do in goodness me an hour's time. I need to sort out my questions. That's with Jonathan Fink from Silicon Curtain. We're hopefully going to have a nice chat then. Check it out.